The market was a mess as usual. A tangle of crates, street vendors, and the occasional homemade sign proclaiming "World's Best Smoothies" swayed in the lazy afternoon breeze. The Earth colony was teeming with humans, who moved through the chaos as if they had never seen a day without it. In the midst of it all, Uncle Kenny was wiping his brow with a red bandana, clearly out of place yet oddly in command. He had been retired for years now, long past the days of sneaking through jungles and dealing with things better left forgotten, but every now and then, something reminded him that he still had a knack for handling messes. A slap on the back of the head from a Vrexian soldier sure qualified. The Vrexian soldier had been enjoying his power trip, dressed in sleek black armor, with a helmet that made him look like a space-bound executioner. He walked with that swagger only the truly out of touch could master. The Earth humans, he'd been told, were subdued, docile, and barely a threat. So when he spotted a woman rolling her eyes as he passed, he didn't think twice. He reached out and slapped her hard across the face. The crowd around them quieted, as if waiting for the inevitable escalation. Kenny hadn't expected to get involved, but he wasn't one to stand idly by when an old-fashioned ass whooping was called for. He watched the soldier, his eyes narrowing as the brute's hand lingered in the air, still raised in arrogant expectation. Claire, the woman who'd just been humiliated, stood still, her posture stiff but not defeated. She was ex-Marine sniper, a sharpshooter who had a reputation for finding targets others couldn't see. Her hand never touched the grip of her weapon, because there was no weapon to touch. The Galactic Council had seen to that. A strict law prohibited humans from carrying anything that could be considered a weapon. That didn't stop Claire from carrying something far more dangerous, a world-class temper, honed by years of military precision. But before she could react, Uncle Kenny moved. He wasn't fast, not by the standards of soldiers or superheroes, but he was clever. With a speed that surprised everyone, including the soldier who thought he was in charge, Kenny grabbed a nearby broom, swung it in a perfect arc, and knocked the soldier's arm off course. The slap missed. The soldier was left with a broom, in his face in a stunned look of confusion. Kenny followed up with a quick jab to the soldier's chest, sending him stumbling back into a pile of crates. "Back in '92, Kenny said, turning to the crowd with a sly grin. "I took down a biker gang with a spatula. What makes you think you're special, Stretch?" Claire blinked, her surprise quickly replaced by a smile that was as sharp as her sniper rifle. "You're a goddamn menace, Kenny," she muttered, already stepping forward to help him finish what he started. The soldier was getting back up now, clearly rattled. He wasn't used to Earth's unpredictability. He had expected them to cower, to fold. Instead, he was face to face with a human who had just used a broom like a medieval knight would use a sword. He stepped forward, preparing for a proper fight, but the sight of Kenny's unamused face made him hesitate. "You know," Kenny said, cracking his knuckles, "you remind me of the time I had to teach my neighbor's son how to stop being a little brat." The soldier's confusion only deepened, and that's when it happened. Kenny, in one swift motion, dropped the broom, reached into his back pocket and pulled out a half-eaten sandwich. He bit into it as if the entire scene had been nothing but an inconvenience. The crowd, at first frozen, couldn't contain their laughter. The absurdity of the situation hit them all at once. A human had just slapped back a spacefaring warrior using a broom and a sandwich. What kind of world was this? The Vrexian soldier, now visibly flustered, reached for his communicator. "I need backup," he muttered into the device. "These humans, they're different." But just as the communicator buzzed to life, a loud crack echoed through the market, the sound of Claire's slingshot. It was a perfect shot. The stone hit the soldier's helmet with a sharp thud, causing him to stumble and drop his communicator. Claire's eyes locked onto the soldier as she readied another stone. "Back off or I'll keep sending gifts," she warned, her voice calm but deadly serious. The soldier, now more rattled than ever, took a step back, eyes darting around. The laughter from the humans grew louder, but it wasn't just mockery. There was an edge to it, a sense of pride. This wasn't the first time Earth had been underestimated, and it surely wouldn't be the last. All right, I get it," the soldier said, holding his hands up in surrender. "But don't think this is over." He tapped his communicator, again ordering the arrival of more soldiers. Kenny, who had finished his sandwich, wiped his mouth and tossed the wrapper into a nearby trash can. He looked at Claire, giving her a nod. "You know," he said casually, "they still think we're playing checkers." Before Claire could reply, an announcement blared from the loudspeakers. "Attention, all civilians. This area is now under the jurisdiction of Rexian forces. Any resistance will be met with full force. Do not attempt to—" Yeah, Kenny interrupted, looking at Claire with a mischievous grin. "Full force. Standard galactic nonsense." He gave a theatrical stretch and patted his stomach. "All right, kid, let's show them how we play." He turned to the nearby market stand, where a few of the local shopkeepers were eyeing him curiously. He leaned in close to one, a man selling what looked like old-fashioned radios. "Hey, you got any good fireworks? Preferably ones that don't mind a little surprise." The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow, but then it dawned on him. "You're really gonna— Just get 'em, buddy. I'll make it worth your while." Claire, meanwhile, had her eye on the sky, watching for any signs of incoming reinforcements. The fight had only just begun, and she wasn't about to let the Vrexians get away with thinking they could just swat Earth aside. But the bigger picture was clear. The Galactic Council thought they could control humanity, restrict them to their designated little corner of the galaxy. They were wrong. The slap, the fight, it was all just the beginning. And as the first of the Vrexian backup ships began to descend into the atmosphere, Uncle Kenny's grin only grew wider. "Let's see how they like this," he muttered under his breath. The human resistance was about to make its mark, and it wasn't going to be subtle. The Vrexian backup was not subtle. Their ships came in low, engines whirring like a swarm of mechanical locusts, casting long, ominous shadows over the colony. The humans who had been watching the market brawl now scattered, their earlier amusement replaced with the cold realization that this was no joke anymore. The soldier who had first slapped Claire had called in the cavalry, and this time they weren't planning to leave until the humans were subdued, or worse, wiped out. Claire glanced at Kenny. His easy confidence hadn't wavered. "You've got a plan, right?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "You bet I do," he said with a wink, adjusting the old baseball cap that never seemed to leave his head. "We just need to make sure they're on the wrong end of the equation." He didn't wait for a response, instead heading toward the nearest convenience store like it was business as usual. Claire followed, her mind already racing through options. The Vrexians weren't just armed with high-tech weapons. Their whole philosophy was one of superiority. They didn't understand the concept of unpredictable. To them, it was a weakness. But Kenny had learned long ago that humans didn't need the fanciest tech to win. Sometimes all it took was an old-school mindset and a little creative thinking. The streets had emptied out quickly, but the resistance wasn't about to go quietly. All around the colony, people were gathering, forming pockets of defense wherever they could. Claire could hear the sounds of the makeshift resistance as they rallied. Car alarms, the clang of metal, the occasional shout of a neighbor. Even the children had joined in, wielding sticks and anything else they could find. It was chaos, but it was their chaos. They had the advantage of familiarity. Kenny was already talking to the convenience store clerk, who looked a bit too startled to comprehend what was going on. "I'll take your entire stock of duct tape," Kenny said casually. "And anything that goes boom, no questions, no time to haggle." The clerk blinked. "You know, that's a lot of tape." "More than enough," Kenny replied. "Trust me. You wouldn't believe what this stuff can do in the right hands." Claire rolled her eyes, but she couldn't help but smirk. The man had a point. Kenny had taken down more than his fair share of high-tech enemies with nothing but tools. From a hardware store and a little ingenuity, she was starting to get the feeling that the Vrexians were about to find that out the hard way. Outside, the Vrexian forces were setting up a perimeter. The air was thick with the hum of their energy shields and the low chatter of their commanders, who were barking orders into their communicators. They were organizing with military precision, but their greatest mistake was thinking that human disorder would be their downfall. Claire surveyed the scene, her sharp eyes picking out weak points in the enemy's formation. The Phyrexians were already starting to move toward the heart of the colony, preparing to clamp down on anyone who resisted, but they hadn't reckoned with what was coming. Claire took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the first strike. Back in the convenience store, Kenny had already begun to work. He was stacking the duct tape into a mountain, his fingers nimble despite his age. There was no rush, no panic in his movements, just the focused calm of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. He wasn't just preparing to fight. He was preparing to win. Claire watched him, her own nerves tightening as the reality of what they were about to do set in. "Got the fireworks," Kenny said with a satisfied grin, patting a box of them. "And a few more surprises for them. You ready?" Claire nodded, though she couldn't help but laugh. "You know, I never thought I'd be fighting an alien army with fireworks and duct tape," Kenny chuckled. "Welcome to Earth, kid. We don't always play by the rules, but we sure as hell know how to make it interesting." The ground shook slightly as the first wave of Phyrexian tanks rolled through the streets, their massive, hovering forms casting a dark, looming shadow over the neighborhood. The rumble of their engines was deafening, and the vibrations under Claire's boots were like a physical reminder of just how outmatched the humans were supposed to be. Except they weren't. As the tanks moved closer, Kenny pulled a remote from his pocket, a sly grin still playing on his lips. "Time to make things interesting," he muttered, pressing a button. The sound of the tanks suddenly went quiet. The power flickered, then died completely. For a moment, everything was eerily still. Then from every direction, the loud crack of fireworks exploded into the sky, sending bright, colorful sparks cascading down. The Phyrexian tanks, still immobilized, turned their weapons toward the sky in a confused, almost comical display of fury. Claire's sniper instincts kicked in immediately. She took cover behind a nearby wall, lining up her shot with the precision that had made her one of the deadliest soldiers Earth had ever produced. From her vantage point, she saw the Phyrexian commanders barking orders, their panic growing by the second. "Let's give them a show," she muttered, squeezing the trigger. The shot rang out, striking a Phyrexian officer right between the eyes. His body slumped, and the remaining soldiers scattered, their formation unraveling in the chaos. The fireworks, the sudden loss of power, and the precise targeting from the humans had thrown them off balance. Kenny grinned and slapped Claire on the back. "That's what I'm talking about. Now we've got their attention." The sound of footsteps approached, and the air was filled with the whir of alien drones buzzing toward them. The drones had been dispatched to locate the humans and neutralize the threat, but they weren't prepared for what came next. A blaring horn echoed from down the street. Kenny had somehow managed to commandeer a nearby garbage truck, and with a wild laugh, he drove it straight toward the advancing drones. The truck's horn was deafening, its wheels sending dust and debris flying as it barreled down the street like a crazed, unstoppable force. The drones fired their energy weapons, but Kenny was too quick. He swerved the truck expertly, causing the drones to miss by inches, their shots bouncing off the armored truck's hull. With a burst of laughter, he slammed the truck into a parked car, sending it flipping into the air and landing directly on top of a drone. "You know, kid," Kenny said, "if I ever get bored of the whole resistance thing, I might take up demolition. I'm pretty good at this." Claire couldn't help but laugh despite herself. "I think you might be onto something." But the battle was far from over. The Phyrexians were regrouping, their elite forces now making their move. Claire's smile faded. This wasn't going to be a quick fight. The odds were stacked against them, but Kenny was right about one thing. Humans had a way of making even the most impossible situations a little more interesting. "You know," Claire said, "this doesn't feel like a fight we can win." Kenny looked her dead in the eye. "Then you haven't been paying attention, kid. We're already winning." The next wave of Phyrexian soldiers was coming, and this time they weren't going to back down. Neither were the humans, and that's when the real war was about to begin. The streets of the colony were now nothing short of a battleground. The initial chaos had morphed into something more organized, with Earth's resistance growing bolder and more inventive by the minute. Humans, fueled by a mix of determination and stubbornness, had taken full advantage of their environment. The Vrexians, on the other hand, had underestimated how far Earth's ingenuity could stretch. They'd expected the resistance to be nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience, but now, as their tanks lay disabled and drones fell from the sky in pieces, they were starting to feel the weight of their mistake. Kenny and Claire had become the unofficial leaders of this ragtag group, but neither of them wanted the title. They had simply been the ones who had fought back first, and now they were in it for the long haul. The Vrexians were regrouping, trying to mobilize their forces into something more coordinated, but they were up against an adversary that didn't follow the rules. Humans were unpredictable, and that was exactly what made them dangerous. Claire stood at the edge of the alley, eyes scanning the scene as she adjusted her rifle. It wasn't her usual sniper rifle, the one she had used to bring down targets from impossible distances, but it would do. She wasn't concerned with long-range shots right now. What mattered was hitting fast and hitting hard. The Vrexians were closing in from every side, their footsteps loud and menacing as they marched toward the heart of the colony. "They're regrouping," Claire said, voice low but sharp. "We need to hit them hard before they get organized." Kenny, never one to shy away from a fight, slapped her on the back and gave her a grin. "You bet we do. But first, I'm thinking it's time for a little distraction." Claire's eyebrows shot up. "What do you have in mind?" He pointed down the street where a large fuel truck was parked, its tanks full of volatile liquid. It wasn't a subtle choice, but then again, Kenny wasn't one for subtlety. He had a knack for bringing chaos wherever he went, and right now, chaos was exactly what they needed. "You know," Kenny said with a grin, "I've always wondered what would happen if we mixed fuel with a little bit of fireworks." Claire groaned. "Please tell me you're not seriously thinking about setting that thing off." Kenny winked at her. "I'm thinking it's time to show these guys just how unpredictable we can be." Before Claire could stop him, he was already moving, his movements quick and confident as he made his way toward the truck. She sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew better than to question his plans. The man had a way of turning the simplest things into weapons of mass destruction, and while it wasn't always by the book, it worked. Kenny reached the truck and started working quickly, pulling wires from his pack and attaching them to the ignition. He didn't need to look over his shoulder to know Claire was watching. She always watched, just in case. But even she had to admit, there was a certain brilliance to what he was doing. It was reckless, sure, but it was also a perfect reflection of humanity's resilience. Meanwhile, the Vrexian forces were advancing. Their heavy boots reverberated against the concrete as they closed in, their armored vehicles moving steadily toward the heart of the colony. The higher-ups had started barking orders into their comms, clearly rattled by the unforeseen resistance. But it was too late. They had underestimated the human spirit, and now they would pay for it. Claire took a deep breath, stepping out from the alley as she adjusted the strap on her rifle. She wasn't sure how much longer they had before the Vrexians made their move. But she knew one thing for certain. They were going to need every ounce of their ingenuity to get out of this alive. She lined up her shot. A Vrexian officer, his back to her, was busy scanning the area. Claire's finger hovered over the trigger. She could take him out right now. One clean shot, and the officer would be down. But that wasn't the goal. She wasn't here for precision. Not today. Her finger squeezed the trigger and the bullet ripped through the air, grazing the officer's helmet. The Vrexian stumbled, startled, but didn't fall. Claire's shot had served its purpose. It was a distraction. Kenny, who had been busy with the truck, didn't waste any time. He pulled the wire, setting off the chain reaction. The truck exploded in a fiery ball of orange and red, sending debris flying in every direction. The shockwave knocked the Vrexians off their feet, their armor providing little protection against the sheer force of the blast. The smoke and fire were blinding, but Claire kept her eyes on the prize. The Vrexian forces were in disarray. The distraction had worked perfectly. Kenny, grinning like a madman, stood in the middle of the street, his hands raised in a victory pose as the flames from the explosion licked at the sky. It was chaos, pure, unadulterated chaos. The kind of chaos Earth was known for. Claire sprinted toward the heart of the action, firing another round to cover their movement. She could hear the shouts of the Vrexian soldiers as they scrambled to regain control. But it was too late. They were caught in the whirlwind now, and the humans had the upper hand. The battle raged on, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a war for control, a war to prove that humans weren't just weak, primitive creatures who could be steamrolled by an alien empire. They were survivors. They were warriors. And they would not go down without a fight. Kenny was already on the move again, his boots pounding against the concrete as he sprinted toward the next objective. He didn't care that the Vrexians had more weapons, more soldiers. What mattered was that they had underestimated Earth's resilience, and that was something they could never fix. He was already planning the next phase, eyes alight with the thrill of the fight. Claire, on the other hand, was focused. She wasn't interested in making a spectacle. She had a job to do. The Vrexians had taken their best shot, but now it was time for the humans to return the favor. She scanned the battlefield, searching for the next target, her sniper skills coming into play. But even as she took aim, she knew the truth. The humans had just gotten started. The Vrexians were about to realize that they had picked the wrong planet to invade, and when they did, it would be too late. The war for Earth's survival was far from over, but Claire could feel it in her bones. The tide was turning. The Vrexians were in trouble, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Ready for round two? Kenny's voice broke through her thoughts, full of that familiar, reckless energy. Always, Claire replied, her smile fierce, and with that, they charged. Forward, ready to bring the fight to the Vrexians in a way they would never forget. The humans weren't done yet, not by a long shot. The Vrexians were now fully aware that the humans weren't just an inconvenience. They were a force to be reckoned with. The once calm and methodical alien invaders had descended into panic, their formations broken, their lines of communication scrambled. It was clear now. Earth had become a thorn in their side, one that refused to be plucked out, no matter how much force they applied. Kenny and Claire stood in the heart of the chaos, watching as the last remnants of the Vrexian command structure tried to rally their troops. The human resistance had moved through the streets, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake, each victory adding to the momentum of their rebellion. But there was no time for celebration. Not yet. The real challenge lay ahead. "Do you think they'll ever learn?" Kenny asked, wiping the sweat from his brow as he adjusted the straps of his gear. The question was rhetorical. It was clear by now that the Vrexians were struggling to adapt to human unpredictability, and it made them dangerous. But the humans had learned too. Every encounter had made them smarter, sharper, more efficient. Claire's fingers ran across the barrel of her rifle, her expression unreadable. "Does it matter?" she said, voice steady. "At this point, it's about sending a message." She wasn't wrong. The Vrexians had underestimated humanity's resilience, but now that they'd pushed Earth's people into a corner, there was no going back. The fight had escalated from one of survival to one of defiance. Earth wasn't just trying to survive anymore. They were fighting for their place in the galaxy. Every move they made was about proving that humans would not be subjugated. The Vrexian leader, Commander Rel, had been watching from a distance, observing the devastation his forces had suffered. But his pride and arrogance still clouded his judgment. He had never once believed the humans could offer real resistance. Now, with his forces decimated and their morale shattered, he had no choice but to escalate the conflict, though at great personal risk. Kenny had noticed the commander's movements earlier. The leader was trying to regroup, trying to salvage what little remained of his invasion force. It was a desperate move, but it wasn't over yet. Not until the final blow had been struck. Claire tilted her head slightly, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "It's not enough to just win battles. We need to hit them where it hurts." Kenny nodded, understanding what she meant. The Vrexians had grown complacent. They assumed their superiority was unchallenged, that their advanced technology and war machines were enough to crush any opposition. But they hadn't counted on the ingenuity of humans. Earth's people had been resourceful, adapting and improvising every step of the way. Now it was time to take the fight to the heart of the Vrexian invasion. They didn't have much time. The Vrexians were planning a counteroffensive, gathering their remaining forces for one final push. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was their last stand, and they would throw everything they had at the humans to maintain their foothold. But Kenny and Claire were ready. They had come too far, learned too much, and seen too much of their own ingenuity to back down now. The plan was simple but risky. While the main resistance forces kept the Vrexian troops distracted, Claire and Kenny would infiltrate the command center, where Raal was coordinating the last-ditch defense, and take him out. The idea was to cripple the Vrexian command structure, disrupt their ability to fight back, and send a message that Earth was not to be taken lightly. Kenny gave a short laugh, his grin a mix of mischief and confidence. I always did like the sound of a good challenge. Claire didn't smile. Focus, this isn't about challenges. This is about survival. Together, they moved through the streets, using the cover of wreckage and smoke from previous skirmishes to conceal their approach. The air was thick with tension, the distant sound of explosions and gunfire ringing in their ears. They'd come this far, but they knew that this was the moment that would make or break everything. The fate of the colony, the success of the human resistance, it all rested on their shoulders. As they neared the Vrexian command center, the enormity of what they were about to do hit them both. This wasn't just another operation. This was the moment that would decide the outcome of the war. The command center was heavily guarded, bristling with the latest in Vrexian technology and security measures. But Kenny and Claire had done this before. Beating impossible odds had become second nature. We get in, we take out Raal, and we get out, Claire said, her voice steady despite the weight of the situation. Got it, Kenny replied, checking his weapon one last time. They crept through the shadows, moving silently as the Vrexian patrols passed by them, unaware of the danger just inches away. Kenny was in his element, the adrenaline giving him the focus he needed. Claire, ever the professional, maintained her calm, her eyes sharp as she scanned their surroundings. Inside the command center, Commander Raal was pacing back and forth, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a strategy to turn the tide in his favor. But the defeat he'd suffered in the streets had rattled him. His once unshakable belief in the superiority of the Vrexian military was starting to crack. He could feel the weight of his mistakes, and that fear was growing into something dangerous. If he didn't act quickly, his forces would fall apart. Completely. He never saw Claire coming. In an instant, she was upon him, her rifle aimed and ready. Kenny appeared a moment later, his presence adding to the chaos of the scene. "Commander," Claire said, her tone icy. Raal turned, startled by the sudden appearance of the two humans. He reached for his weapon, but it was too late. Kenny was already there, grabbing his arm and twisting it with surprising strength. "You're done," Kenny said, his voice a mixture of satisfaction and something darker. "It's over." For a moment, Raal hesitated, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. He had failed. His invasion had crumbled, his forces shattered, and now the humans were standing in front of him, victorious. "You think this is over?" Raal spat, his arrogance still seeping through despite the defeat. "You cannot defeat the Vrexians." "We are—" Claire's gun pressed against his throat, cutting off his words. "No more talk, you've had your chance." The commander's eyes flickered with something like fear, but it was too late for him to escape. The Vrexian Empire had been humbled, and Earth had won, though the cost had been great. Kenny and Claire exchanged a brief glance, knowing that their mission was complete. But even as they walked away from the command center, they knew the war wasn't over. The galaxy would never look at Earth the same way again. The message had been sent. Earth had fought back, and they'd won. And as long as there were humans willing to fight, they would never be forgotten.